The pale morning light crept through the old wooden window frames like hesitant fingers, brushing against the corners of a quiet cabin kitchen nestled deep in the Adira Mountains. Eleanor Carter, Ellie as he used to call her, stood barefoot, on the cool wooden floor, her hands moving by memory more than intent. The kettle whistled gently as steam curled into the still air, and she poured 2 cups of coffee. She always made 2, one for herself, one for Michael. 4 years had passed since the day he disappeared. 4 winters, 4 springs. Long enough, people said, to move on, to let go. But Ellie hadn't, couldn't. Each morning she performed the same ritual, a quiet dance of denial and devotion. The cup on the left always remained untouched, cold, still, and steady, just like the hollow ache in her chest. Outside, the mountains were still shrouded in mist. Fog clung to the pines, slithered between the trees like ghosts reluctant to leave. The silence was almost sacred. And then, a sound. Soft. Barely there. She turned her head toward the porch. Through the swirling mist, a figure emerged, slow, purposeful, not a man, a dog, a large weathered German shepherd, his amber eyes locked on hers. Ellie froze, the coffee mug trembling in her hand. The dog moved closer. His fur was streaked with mud, his legs scarred, but there was strength in the way he walked, like a soldier who had seen too many winters and yet refused to bow to any of them. It wasn't just his sudden appearance that took her breath away. It was what he carried in his mouth, a jacket, blue, mud-caked, worn, but unmistakable. Michael's. The mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, but she barely heard the crash. Her eyes were fixed on the dog, on the jacket, on the impossible weight of memory that had just come crashing through her doorway. She opened the door slowly, breath catching in her throat. The mist curled around her ankles, cold and damp. "Hello?" she whispered. Her voice broke on the wind. The dog stepped forward, calm, deliberate. He lowered his head and gently placed the jacket at her feet. Then he sat down, eyes steady, tail unmoving. Ellie knelt, hands trembling as she reached for the jacket. The fabric was cold and wet, but as she drew it close, a familiar scent rose from it. Sweat, rain, and beneath it all, a trace of sandalwood, Michael's scent. A sob escaped her lips as she clutched the jacket to her chest, pressing it against the hole that had hollowed inside her heart for 4 long years. And then her fingers brushed something strange along the seam, a hard edge beneath the lining. She found the small slit, pulled out a folded, faded scrap of paper. Her hands shook as she opened it. The ink had bled. The paper was stained. But the words, those hurried, desperate strokes, were unmistakably his. "My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, it means I'm in trouble." She gasped, clutched it tighter. The note was real. The dog was real. The hope she had buried was suddenly screaming to be heard. She stumbled back into the kitchen, fingers fumbling for the phone on the wall. "Peter," she whispered as she dialed, voice shaking. "Peter Walker, I need you. He might be alive." The old pickup truck rumbled up the gravel path, its tires grinding softly against the earth still damp from last night's rain. Peter Walker stepped out slowly, knees stiff from a lifetime of hard service. He was older now, retired from his days as a search and rescue inspector, but his eyes, those stayed sharp. Years in the field had taught him that the mountain never truly forgot, and neither did he. Ellie stood on the porch of her weather-worn cabin, cradling the mud-streaked jacket. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from recognition. The jacket was unmistakable. Blue canvas, frayed cuffs, the brass buttons dulled by time. It had belonged to Michael. Her Michael. Missing for 4 years. The dog, still silent, still watchful, sat at her feet. A German shepherd, his fur grizzled, his eyes golden and unreadable. Not a bark, not a whimper. Just presence, still as stone, yet charged with intent. When Peter saw him, he froze mid-step. "That can't be," he muttered, stepping closer, voice trailing into the mist that hung like breath around them. The dog didn't flinch. "Bruno?" Peter whispered, as if saying the name might break the morning apart. The dog gave the faintest wag of his tail. Just once. Peter turned to Ellie, voice low, reverent. "We've heard stories these past years. Hikers, lost kids. Every time someone swore they were guided back by a dog. We called him the mountain guardian. Most of us thought it was just myth." Bruno remained still, eyes never leaving Peter. There was recognition there, mutual respect, something beyond the animal. Ellie knelt beside him, gently placing her hand on his fur. It was damp, cold, but pulsing with life. "He brought me this," she said, lifting the jacket. Peter stepped forward and examined it carefully, his brow furrowed, fingertips brushing over the fabric like a forensic artist. This hasn't been out here 4 years. No mold, no decay. Zippers smooth. This was worn recently." A breath caught in Ellie's throat. Then Michael. Peter nodded slowly, the weight of the implication anchoring his voice. "Might still be out there." As if on cue, Bruno stood up and looked toward the tree line, his tail raised, ears forward. Not restless, resolute. "He wants us to follow," Ellie whispered, heart racing. They didn't speak again, just moved. Flashlights, ropes, boots. Peter checked his gear with the precision of muscle memory. Ellie scribbled a note she left behind in the cabin, just in case. The dog waited at the edge of the forest, patient but urgent. When they stepped beyond the threshold of trees, he led. The way, the forest grew dense. Sunlight fractured through the canopy in golden beams. Every rustle felt charged. Ellie's breath came shallow, but Bruno's presence anchored her like a heartbeat. With every step, she felt closer to something, not just the memory of Michael, but to him, to truth. They passed places she'd never dared to enter. The forest no longer frightened her. Peter marked trees as they walked, knots of orange ribbon fluttering behind them like breadcrumbs, and then Bruno stopped. At the base of an old pine was a piece of torn fabric, gray, synthetic, unmistakably part of a climbing pack. Peter crouched, picked it up. Same material Michael used. Bruno turned to Ellie, his eyes deep, unblinking. In that moment, she saw it. Not just the guide, not just the protector. He had always been waiting for her to be ready. Peter spoke, his voice hoarse with awe. "Ellie, this isn't just chance. He's leading us somewhere." They camped that night beneath the stars, just beyond a quiet stream. The water murmured softly in the background, lulling the dark into peace. Bruno lay close to Ellie, his body, a warm shield against the mountain chill. She stared up at the sky. The stars twinkled faintly through thin cloud patches, and the forest whispered around them. A chorus of owls, wind through needles, the distant groan of shifting trees. She remembered the last time Michael kissed her forehead. The smell of coffee. The sound of him zipping that blue jacket, his boots clicking on the wooden floor, the way he said he'd be back before sunset, a playful wink as he shut the door. Now, with Bruno beside her and Peter quietly checking their bearings, she let herself whisper it aloud, "Michael, if you're out there, we're coming." And Bruno, as if hearing the name, gently placed his head against her side. His fur was rough, but the warmth that seeped through it was undeniable. She looked into his eyes and saw no fear, no confusion, only certainty. Michael was not a memory. He was a The morning broke with a hush, the mist clinging to the forest like breath on glass. Ellie woke to the soft pressure of Bruno's nose against her arm, his eyes filled with quiet urgency. She sat up, brushing dew from her jacket, and looked around. Peter was already awake, crouched by the dwindling fire, pouring hot water into tin mugs. "He's ready," Peter said, tilting his head toward Bruno. "And I don't think he's willing to wait." Ellie packed in silence. The crumpled note from Michael lay in her pocket, worn and pressed close to her heart like a fragile compass. They moved quickly, following Bruno's lead into the woods. The path he took wasn't marked, not on any map, not by any human memory. It wound through thick underbrush, across shallow brooks and over crumbling stone walls lost to time. Bruno paused often, not in confusion but in calculation. He would sniff the air, tilt his head, and then continue forward with a certainty that seemed more spiritual than instinctual. Every so often, Ellie would glance at Peter, whose face bore the quiet awe of a man watching something beyond explanation. By midday, they reached a rocky slope half buried in pine needles. Bruno bounded ahead, then turned, tail wagging once as if to say, "You can do this." Ellie hesitated, breath catching, but Peter gave her a gentle nudge. "He believes in you. I think that's all that matters." At the top, they were greeted by a hidden valley, cupped between old trees like a secret. At its center stood the collapsed skeleton of a cabin, moss-covered and half-eaten by vines. Bruno moved without hesitation, leading them straight to the ruin. Inside, it was silent. The air smelled of mold and soot. Ellie stepped carefully, her boots brushing aside needles and broken glass. Then she froze. A charred notebook lay beneath a fallen beam. She bent, hands trembling, and opened it. Most pages had been scorched into unreadability, but one survived. "Storm came last night. Saw movement by the ridge. Can't trust them. Staying. Quiet. They're close." Peter read over her shoulder. Someone was here, someone afraid. Then came Bruno's bark, short, sharp. He stood at the edge of the trees, body tense. They rushed to him and saw what he had found. Human footprints, fresh, descending into a narrow ravine. Peter crouched beside them, frowning. "These are recent. Someone else is out here. And not just wandering. Michael?" Ellie's heart surged, but so did her fear. They followed the trail deeper, the light dimming as the trees thickened. Ellie's shoulders ached from her pack, her legs burned. But Bruno never slowed. Then, just before dusk, something metallic glinted in the fading light. Peter dropped to a knee. "Tripwire," he hissed. "This is no accident." Ellie's blood ran cold. Bruno growled low and shifted in front of her, blocking the path. They circled wide, careful not to disturb the trap. As night fell, they made camp in a clearing off the main trail. The fire they built was small and quick-burning. Bruno didn't rest. He sat at the edge of the firelight, ears high, watching. Ellie lay awake, listening to the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional call of an owl. Her thoughts circled like vultures. This was no longer a search. It was a pursuit, and they weren't the only ones tracking. Morning came gray and heavy. Bruno pushed forward again, navigating a series of switchbacks along the base of a cliff. They found more signs. An old canteen with Michael's initials, a carved symbol in a tree Ellie recognized. From Michael's sketchbook, each discovery was another heartbeat, another whisper. He's alive. And then came the moment Ellie wouldn't forget. They found a cave entrance, narrow and half hidden by ivy. Bruno stopped, nose twitching, body taut. Peter scanned the area. There's a draft, could be a passage inside. Bruno gave a single bark, then walked in. The cave swallowed them in damp silence. Ellie's flashlight trembled in her hands. The air smelled of stone and old secrets. Bruno led them through a twisting series of chambers, deeper and deeper. Then Ellie heard it, a sound that stopped her heart. Music, a faint melody distorted by echo. Louis Armstrong, "What a Wonderful World." Her flashlight beam quivered. Ahead, a dusty radio sat on a flat rock, faintly glowing. Beside it, a rusted knife pinning a note. "If you're reading this, it means you didn't give up. I'm still waiting." Ellie dropped to her knees, the words blurred through her tears. Bruno sat beside her, unmoving. He was here. "Peter," whispered. And suddenly the shadows didn't feel empty. They felt like they were watching, listening, protecting. This journey wasn't just about finding Michael. It was about following the invisible thread of love, woven through every step, every sign, every faithful bark. And Bruno, Bruno was the keeper of that thread. As they left the cave, light blooming once more through the trees, Ellie turned to Peter. Her voice was steadier now. Someone's hiding something, but Bruno's not going to let them stop us. Peter nodded. Then let's find out what's waiting at the end of this path. Bruno trotted ahead, never once looking back, as if he already knew the truth and was simply waiting for them to catch up. Bruno led them through the narrowing paths, his pace slowing only when the terrain demanded care. Peter checked the compass often, but even that failed them inside the mountain's magnetic heart. "It's all static," he murmured, tapping. "The casing." "We're flying blind." Ellie stayed close to Bruno, watching every twitch of his ears, every pause in his stride. The shepherd's instincts seemed sharpened by something beyond training, something almost ancient, like a sense passed down from creatures that once walked these paths before humans ever carved trails. A soft growl pulled Ellie from her thoughts. Bruno had stopped before a narrow crevice between stone walls. The opening looked barely wide enough for a person to slip through, but the dog was already easing his body inside. Peter examined the surrounding area. Fresh prints, human, could be days old or hours. Ellie didn't hesitate. She squeezed in after Bruno, her fingers brushing the cold, damp stone as she moved deeper underground. The passage closed around them like a throat swallowing their light. Inside, the air grew colder. Water dripped from the ceiling in soft, echoing splashes. Their flashlights cast long, shifting shadows on the walls. The darkness wasn't just absence of light. It felt sentient, like it was watching. After what felt like hours, Bruno let out a low, cautious whine and stopped beside a small pile of stones, placed intentionally. Ellie knelt and began moving them with trembling fingers. Beneath them was a plastic-wrapped bundle, a water-stained notebook, a broken compass, and a small carving. A crude but recognizable figure of a German shepherd. "Michael," she whispered. Peter examined the items. "These haven't been here long. He left them for someone to find." Bruno turned away, walking slowly toward a narrow path descending deeper into the cave. They followed. At one point, the ground gave way to a sheer drop. Ropes, anchored and worn, dangled into the abyss. "Climbing. Gear," Peter muttered. "That means he went down." One by one, they descended. The rope creaked with each movement. Ellie slipped halfway, heart pounding, but Bruno lunged forward, his teeth gripping the edge of her jacket, steadying her just long enough for Peter to pull her back. When her feet finally touched solid ground again, she sank to her knees, breath ragged. At the base lay a cavern, its walls glittering with strange minerals glowing faintly as if breathing. In the center was a small camp, blankets, tools, a makeshift stove, and another note weighted by a rock. "If you find this, I'm..." Close, but so are they. Peter's jaw clenched. He wasn't alone down here. Someone or something was watching him. Suddenly, Bruno barked once, sharp and urgent. Footsteps echoed in the distance. They froze. Ellie doused her light, heart hammering in her chest. They crouched in silence. Somewhere deep in the shadows, something moved. They waited, barely breathing. The footsteps faded. When they dared to move again, Bruno remained alert, his body tense. Peter swept the cave with his flashlight. "There's another tunnel over here." Bruno led them into it without hesitation. The tunnel was narrow, slick with moisture. The deeper they went, the more signs they found. Shreds of fabric, a snapped pencil, initials scratched into stone. Suddenly, Peter halted. He pointed to a series of lines etched into the rock. "It's a map. Michael's." Ellie leaned in. The lines formed a labyrinth of pathways and landmarks. One section was circled in red. "Gateway," it read. "What did he find?" Peter whispered. Hours passed. The cave twisted and turned like a buried serpent. At times they crawled on hands and knees. At others they waded through water waist deep. Bruno never hesitated. He stopped only when he sensed danger. At one point he halted abruptly and growled. Peter swept his light forward. A trap. A wire strung across the path, rigged to drop a rock slide. Someone didn't want visitors. Peter muttered, carefully, disabling it. Later they reached a chamber filled with crystals, clear, glowing, faintly blue. Bruno stepped aside, letting Ellie approach first. She touched one. It hummed faintly, vibrating beneath her skin. Peter studied the formations. They match Michael's notes. High energy retention. He wasn't just surviving down here. He was researching. Then came the sound that broke everything, a voice, muffled, faint, human. Ellie spun, flashlight raised. "Michael?" she called, her voice cracking. Silence. Bruno growled again, but this time not at danger, at urgency. He barked once, then turned and ran. They followed, through narrow tunnels, slipping over slick stone, scraping elbows and knees. The tunnel opened into a chamber with an old radio sitting on a rock. It crackled. A song emerged, faint, distorted. Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World." Ellie dropped to her knees. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Bruno sat beside her, pressing his head to her shoulder. Peter picked up a note tucked beneath the radio. "If you're reading this, it means you didn't give up. I'm still waiting." Ellie whispered through sobs. "He's alive." Bruno barked again, this time short and triumphant. Behind them, the shadows shifted. The truth was closer now, close enough to touch, close enough to fear. They had found the first gate, and Bruno would not stop until the final door opened. The light within the cavern flickered as Peter's flashlight swept across the makeshift camp. Michael's maps, notes, and mineral samples were still intact, carefully preserved in waterproof containers. A geologist's silent testament to years of survival against impossible odds. Ellie sat beside one of the crates, Michael's journal clutched in her trembling hands. Each line she read felt like a whisper from the void he had vanished into. It was more than data. It was his voice, his presence. Peter examined the soil samples laid out on a flat rock table. The mineral traces confirmed what Michael had discovered. An unstable crystalline formation capable of storing energy far beyond current technologies. Revolutionary, dangerous, valuable enough to make someone vanish. He found something they couldn't allow to be public, Peter muttered more to himself than to Ellie, and they made sure he disappeared before he could speak. But Michael had not vanished alone. Bruno, sitting quietly beside Ellie, shifted his weight and nudged the backpack with his nose. Ellie opened it and found another notebook tucked inside, a newer one. Its pages detailed not just discoveries, but warnings. Michael had begun to suspect he was being followed even before the abduction. He had written, "If anything happens to me, Bruno knows the way. He's my map now." Ellie felt her breath catch. Bruno hadn't just waited. He had remembered. Carried the scent, the instinct, the memory of paths walked together. He had chosen the moment to return because he had known she was ready to follow. Peter unfolded a large hand-drawn map from one of the boxes. It led deeper into the mountains, a place Michael called the Heart, marked with red ink circled 3 times. Next to it, a single word, proof. As they prepared to move, Bruno barked once, not loud, but urgent. He paced toward the cave's rear wall, where a narrow tunnel sloped downward. Ellie followed, flashlight in hand. The air grew colder, the walls closer. Water dripped steadily, echoing like distant footsteps. And then, footprints, fresh ones, pressed into the damp earth, Michael's boots. At the tunnel's end, they found what he had hidden, a cache of samples, a backup USB drive, and a recorder. Peter played the last entry. Michael's voice came through, faint, breathless, but defiant. "If you find this, it means I held on. The world needs to know. This is real. And they will try to stop you, Ellie, but trust Bruno, he will never let you fall." Ellie pressed her forehead to the recorder, her tears falling onto the dirt. Bruno stepped close, pressing his head against her shoulder, his breath warm, steadying. She closed her eyes, drawing strength from the dog's unwavering presence. It dawned on her just how deep Bruno's loyalty went, past grief, past fear, into something primal and unwavering. He was not Just Michael's dog. He was a sentry, a bridge between the lost and those still searching. Suddenly the silence shattered. A faint noise echoed down the tunnel. Voices. Unfamiliar, urgent, they were not alone. Peter moved fast, signaling Ellie to pack everything. Bruno growled low in his throat, his stance protective. They backed out, retracing their steps. But before they could reach the main cavern, a figure stepped into view, tall, shadowed, and armed. A confrontation followed. Ellie's voice trembled but held firm. "We're leaving. We have what we need." The man sneered. "You're not taking anything." Bruno growled louder now, fur bristling. Before Ellie could speak again, he lunged, not to attack but to distract. In the chaos, Peter tackled the man. Ellie ran, Bruno beside her, guiding her through twists and bends. Only he remembered. The map in her hand shook. The light flickered. But she never lost faith in the dog at her side. They emerged under moonlight, breathless. In the distance, sirens. Peter had sent a signal. Help was coming. The evidence was safe. And Michael's voice, through his words, still lived. Ellie collapsed, beside Bruno, clutching the notebook to her chest. She whispered, "We're almost there." Bruno licked her cheek gently. And in that moment she understood. Michael's survival was not the end. The truth was the beginning. They didn't stop moving. Authorities arrived, the area was secured, and evidence transferred. But Ellie couldn't rest. Not yet. Not until she reached the place Michael called the heart. 2 days later, guided by Bruno and the hand-drawn map, she and Peter made the journey. The path was harsh, the weather cruel. But nothing deterred Bruno. He led them through narrow ridges and over icy streams until they reached a hidden ravine cloaked in mist. There, embedded into the cliffside, was an opening. Natural, but reinforced. They entered cautiously. Inside was another chamber, deeper and darker than the rest. It pulsed with a subtle light from the crystalline veins running through the rock. In the center lay a cot, a lantern, a coat, and Michael. He was thin, bearded, but alive. Ellie ran to him. He rose slowly, disoriented, eyes blinking into the beam of her flashlight. "Ellie," he whispered. She didn't answer with words, just wrapped her arms around him, sobbing. Bruno barked, tail wagging. Michael knelt, pressing his forehead to Bruno's. "You found her," he whispered. Peter stood back, allowing the moment to unfold. They didn't ask questions at first. They just held each other. Later, Michael explained. He had escaped after being held by those who wanted his research buried. Bruno had helped him survive the escape, but Michael had been too injured to travel far. He had stayed hidden, leaving clues. "I trusted he'd bring you to me," Michael said. "I just didn't know how long it would take." Now they had what they needed. The evidence, the witness, the truth. And Bruno had done what no human could. He had guarded a secret, protected a legacy, and reunited a family split by darkness. The story would go on. But for one night under the stars, they were whole again. Morning came softly to the forest. Mist clung to the hills like a memory not yet ready to be released. From the porch of their little cabin, now a place not of grief, but of healing, Ellie watched the golden light spill over the ridge. Michael sat beside her, thinner than he had been, quieter, but whole, alive, real, and between them, as he had always been, was Bruno. The old shepherd lay at Ellie's feet, his blue scarf freshly washed and tied neatly around his neck. The stitches she had sewn, Hope Keeper, were a small token of the truth now known to all. Bruno had not only found Michael, he had held their family together through 4 long, merciless years. The news had spread quickly. The energy discovery, the conspiracy to silence it, the miraculous reunion, all of it became headlines. But the world's fascination could never match the quiet triumph felt in that little mountain home, where lavender now bloomed in the garden and Michael's journals sat in the windowsill, drying in the sun. Peter visited often, helping with repairs, bringing stories from town, always with a quiet smile for Bruno. That dog, he would say, could teach the world a thing or two about loyalty. One afternoon, Ellie found Michael sketching in the garden. Not maps this time, but scenes. Bruno silhouetted against the forest, Ellie waiting by the steps, a young girl with her father's eyes planting lavender at the edge of the fence. They had begun dreaming again, talking of lectures, of telling their story, of letting Bruno's tale be more than a miracle. It would be a lesson in trust, in faith, in the invisible threads that bind those who love each other through impossible distances. On the day they returned to the exact clearing, where Bruno had first reappeared, they brought a carved stone. Simple, weathered. It bore no dates, only 3 words. He never gave up. Bruno stood beside them as they placed it, his eyes scanning the trees not as a sentinel, but as one who recognized his task was nearly complete. He had carried them to the end of the darkness. He had guarded every trail, every whispered promise, until the garden could bloom again. That evening, as stars blinked into the navy sky, Ellie, Michael, and Bruno sat on the porch. No words passed between them. Only the deep shared breath of lives returned to each other. Bruno rested his head on Ellie's lap, his body tired, but heart full. "I used to think the world ran on reason," Michael said. "Equations, logic, but I was wrong." Ellie smiled softly. "It runs on love and the ones who carry it even when we forget how." Bruno thumped his tail once. The wind carried the scent of lavender. The stars watched silently above. And in that small cabin on the edge of the Adira Mountains, a story came to rest, not with an ending, but with a beginning sown in the soil of return. Bruno closed his eyes, his breathing deep and steady, as the night wrapped gently around them all.